You canceled the plans. Again, you told them you weren't feeling well, that you were tired, that something came up. And technically, none of that was a lie. You are tired, something did come up. That something was the overwhelming need to be alone, to stay home. To exist in a space where no one is watching, expecting, or needing anything from you. And now you're sitting in that space, the space you desperately needed, and instead of feeling relieved, you feel guilty. Guilty for canceling, guilty for disappointing someone, guilty for choosing yourself. Guilty for needing this much time alone in the first place. This is the paradox of staying home. The thing that brings you relief also brings you shame, and until you understand why, the guilt will follow you into every moment of rest you try to claim. Because the guilt isn't about staying home, it's about what staying home means to you. There's a man who turns down invitations constantly, not because he dislikes the people inviting him, but because the thought of going out feels impossible. He imagines getting ready, driving there, making conversation, managing his energy, reading the room, and by the time he's finished imagining it, he's already exhausted. So he stays home and immediately starts apologizing to himself, to them, to some invisible standard that says staying home means you're failing at life. He knows logically that staying home is a valid choice, that he's allowed to have boundaries, that rest is necessary, but logic doesn't touch the guilt because the guilt isn't logical, it's learned. This is what most people miss about guilt. It's not a reflection of what you're doing wrong, it's a reflection of what you were taught was wrong, and somewhere in your past, you learned that choosing yourself over others is selfish. That needing space means something is wrong with you, that being social is good and being alone is avoidable. And those beliefs are still running, even when you know better. You've probably felt this when you stay home on a weekend and see other people posting about their plans. Suddenly, your quiet Saturday feels like evidence that you're missing out, that you're wasting time, that everyone else is living life correctly, and you're somehow failing by staying still. But that's not true. You're not failing. You're just recovering from a world that demands constant availability, constant performance, constant engagement with people, tasks, expectations that never stop asking for more. And staying home is how you survive that. There's a woman who loves her friends. She genuinely enjoys their company, but after every social event, she needs days to recover, not because the event was bad, but because being present for others drains something in her that doesn't refill quickly. She performs, she listens, she responds, she mirrors, and all of it is real, but all of it costs energy, more energy than people who don't experience social anxiety will ever understand. And when she stays home to recharge, the guilt tells her she's being a bad friend, that she's letting people down, that if she really cared, she'd push through the exhaustion and show up anyway. But pushing through doesn't make her a better friend. It makes her resentful because she's giving from an empty place, and giving from emptiness doesn't sustain connection, it destroys it. This is the truth about staying home that guilt tries to hide. Sometimes staying home is the most honest thing you can do, because showing up when you don't have the capacity isn't connected, it's performance, and performance eventually collapses. Most people don't struggle with staying home occasionally. They struggle with needing to stay home as often as they do, with the fact that their tolerance for social interaction is lower than what feels acceptable. With the gap between how much they can handle and how much they think they should be able to handle. And that gap is where the guilt lives. There's a student who feels guilty every time he stays in his room while his roommates go out. He hears them getting ready, hears them laughing, hears the door close behind them. And he sits in the silence they left behind and feels like something is wrong with him, like he's missing some essential component that makes socializing easy for everyone else. But he's not missing anything, he's just wired differently. His nervous system processes social interaction as work, as something that requires vigilance, monitoring, constant adjustment. And after a week of classes, meetings, group projects, casual hallway conversations, he has nothing left. He needs the silence. He needs solitude, needs the space where he doesn't have to manage how he's perceived. And the guilt he feels isn't about what he's doing. It's about the belief that needing this much space means he's broken. But he's not broken, he's just honest about his limits. This is where the guilt gets complicated, because society rewards people who can do more, who needs less, who shows up consistently without complaining, And if you're someone who can't do that, you start to believe the problem is you. That you're too sensitive, too introverted, too anxious, too much work for people to deal with. And so you push yourself, you say yes when you want to say no, you show up when you need to stay home, you perform with energy you don't have, and eventually you burn out, not dramatically, just slowly, quietly. Until one day you realize you don't remember the last time you actually wanted to go somewhere instead of feeling obligated to. There's a woman who says yes to everything, every invitation, every request, every opportunity to be social, not because she wants to, but because saying no feels cruel, like she's rejecting people, like she's prioritizing herself in a way that's fundamentally selfish. And so she goes, she shows up, she smiles, she participates, and the entire time she's counting down the minutes until she can leave, until she can return to the quiet, until she can stop pretending that this is easy for her. And when she finally gets home, the relief is so profound that it confirms what she already suspected. She's not like other people. Other people don't need this much recovery time. Other people don't feel exhausted by the things that seem to energize everyone else. This is the isolating part of staying home guilty. It makes you feel like you're the only one struggling, like everyone else has figured out how to be social without it costing them. Like your need for solitude is evidence of some fundamental inadequacy. But it's not. Your need for solitude is just your need, and needs aren't moral failures. The reason you feel guilty for staying home is because you've internalized the belief that your worth is tied to your availability, that being a good person means being accessible, that loving people means always showing up. Those boundaries are rejections instead of necessities. And those beliefs are destroying you. Because you can't sustain relationships by abandoning yourself. You can't maintain connection by ignoring your own needs. You can't be present for others when you're not present for yourself. And staying home is how you become present for yourself again. There's a man who used to force himself to attend everything, every party, every gathering, every casual hangout. He thought that's what friendship required, that if he didn't show up, people would forget about him. That his presence was the only thing keeping him connected. And then one day he stopped going, not to test anyone, just because he couldn't do it anymore. He stayed home, sent his apologies, waited for the fallout, and nothing happened. His friends still texted him, still invited him to things, still cared about him even when he wasn't performing constant availability. And he realized the story he'd been telling himself wasn't true, that his worth wasn't contingent on his presence, that people could care about him even when he chose rest over socializing. This is what changes when you stop feeling guilty for staying home. You realize that the people who matter understand, and the people who don't understand don't actually know you well enough to judge your choices. Because anyone who truly knows you knows that your need for space isn't personal. It's not about them. It's about you protecting the limited energy you have so you can show up authentically when it matters instead of showing up resentfully because obligation demanded it. This is internal control in action. You can't control whether people are disappointed when you cancel. You can't control whether they understand your need for solitude, but you can control whether you abandon yourself to maintain their comfort. And choosing yourself isn't selfish, it's survival. There's a woman who used to apologize every time she stayed home. She'd send long explanations about why she couldn't make it. She'd promise to do better next time. She'd reassure people that it wasn't about them. And all of that apologizing just reinforced the guilt, because it sent the message that staying home was something that required justification. And then she stopped apologizing. She started saying no without explanation. I can't make it tonight. I need to stay this weekend. I'm not available. Simple, direct, without the guilt-laden preamble. And the first few times felt terrifying, like she was being rude, like people would be angry, but they weren't. Most people just said okay and moved on, because her guilt was hers, not theirs, and she'd been carrying it alone all along. This is the practice. You stop treating staying home like something you need permission for. You stop apologizing for having limits. You stop explaining yourself to people who aren't asking for explanations. You just say no. And let that be enough. You also start examining the beliefs driving the guilt. When you feel guilty for staying home, ask yourself what story you're telling. Am I believing that staying home makes me a bad person? Am I believing that people will abandon me if I'm not constantly available? Am I believing that my needs are less important than everyone else's comfort? Most of the time, the guilt is rooted in a belief that isn't true, and naming the belief weakens its power. There's a man who realized his guilt wasn't about disappointing his friends. It was about disappointing the version of himself he thought he should be, the outgoing version, the social version, the version that didn't need so much time alone. And he'd been punishing himself for not being that person. But that person didn't exist. That was a standard he'd created based on what he thought was normal. And normal isn't a real thing, it's just the average of what's visible. And what's visible doesn't include all the people who are quietly staying home because they need to. You're not alone in needing space, you're just alone in your guilt about needing it, and that loneliness is optional. The truth is that staying home isn't avoidable unless you're staying home to escape something you need to face. But if you're staying home because you're tired, because you're overstimulated, because you need to recharge, because being around people costs more energy than you have right now, that's not avoidance. That's honoring your limits. And honoring your limits is how you avoid burnout, how you maintain the relationships that actually matter, how you show up as someone who's present instead of someone who's pretending. There's a woman who used to feel guilty every time she chose herself, and now she doesn't, not because she stopped caring about people, but because she realized that caring for herself makes her better at caring for others. That rest isn't selfish. Those boundaries aren't rejections. That staying home sometimes is what allows her to show up authentically other times. And that shift didn't happen overnight. It happened through practice, through choosing herself even when the guilt screamed, through noticing that nothing terrible happened when she prioritized rest, through realizing that the people who mattered understood, and the people who didn't weren't her responsibility to manage. This is what becomes possible when you stop feeling guilty for staying home. You reclaim your energy, you rebuild your capacity, you reconnect with the version of yourself that exists beneath the performance. And you realize that you were never failing by staying home. You were just surviving in the only way that made sense. Your need for solitude isn't a flaw. It's not evidence that something is wrong with you. It's just a need. And needs don't require justification. They just require honoring. So the next time you feel guilty for staying home, remind yourself that guilt is learned, that you're allowed to have limits, that choosing rest over obligation isn't selfish. It's necessary, and the people who truly see you will understand. And the ones who don't weren't seeing you clearly in the first place. Subscribe to The Anxious Mind to understand your anxiety without shame and train a calmer mind. Like this video if you want clarity without judgment. What's one thing you wish people understood about why you need to stay home sometimes? Leave it in the comments. And if this resonated, the next video will show you why your mind makes rest feel impossible even when your body is exhausted. Thank you for being here. You're not alone in this.